Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where mental health professionals get together and talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. Today, I'm joined with someone whose work is very near and dear to the work that I do as a religious trauma therapist. I'm joined by Dr. Darrel Ray. Darrel, thanks for joining me today.
Well, glad to be here. I hope I get some good therapy from you today. Is that what the deal is?
Yeah, that's the deal.
Okay.
No, you're kind of one of the movers and shakers behind the Secular Therapy Project, which I am on as a religious trauma therapist. So I always like to kind of start with how you got where you're at. We're not going to go through your whole history, but starting with the Secular Therapy Project and recovering from religion, can you kind of fill people in who maybe are not familiar with those things or your work on where those things kind of came from?
Sure. Well, I started out, my own journey was as a clinical psychologist for about 10 years, primarily working with families and juveniles. Then I moved into organizational psychology, did that for another almost 30 years, around 30 years. So I saw kind of other sides of the world of psychology. But throughout that time, I saw a lot of need for a good therapy that was sensitive to the influences of religion on our psychology and everything down to our brain chemistry actually. So when I published my book in 2009, The God Virus, I I just got overwhelmed with people who read the book and then came to me and said, "I need help." Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm a psychologist, but number one, I'm no longer licensed. I don't want to be licensed. I don't want to do therapy anymore. I want to do this. And so I was constantly referring people to therapists that I knew, but I knew, the universe of therapists that I personally can recommend is pretty tiny.
Hmm.
And then in 2012, when I published my fourth book, actually, it's called Sex and God: How Religion Distorts Sexuality. I got overwhelmed again with people saying, I need a sex therapist. I need somebody who's not going to send me back to church for masturbating too much or telling me I'm a porn addict
Hmm.
and that sort of stuff. And that finally tripped the trigger. And I realized, dang, I got to get out and help these people. And I get on Psychology Today and look, or I can get on the interwebs and look, and I could not find therapists that I could trust. I couldn't find a therapist. You could find a therapist. They look like they would be good from their webpage, but you scratch a little bit below the surface and they got a Jesus statement somewhere or a Buddhist statement somewhere, or even a Bible sitting on a picture in their office. Oh, by
Hmm.
the way, I've got about 20 Bibles right back there. But they're not for the thing that more usually is. It's more for my research and my books. But so I don't want to look like a hypocrite having lots of Bibles in my office. But so that led me to think, how can I connect people? And here's that kind of a funny twist to that, Jeremy. In the early 2000s, I got into online dating.
Hmm.
I'd been married twice and decided that ain't for me anymore. I got on online dating. I became polyamorous, and I'm still polyamorous, by the way. And I just thought, there's it is hard to find a therapist who is LGBTQ friendly, who's poly friendly, who's religious trauma friendly, or at least understands what it is. And quite frankly, in 2010, when I was at a conference with Dr. Marlene Winnell, uh, the person who coined the term religious trauma, she came up to me. We'd never met, but we knew of each other's works. I liked her
Hmm.
book and her work, Journey Free, and her book. I'm drawing a blank on her book right now. We want to be sure.
Leaving the fold.
Okay, Leaving the Fold. Right. I loved her book. And so I meet her and we're having a good chat. And he says, I got this new idea I'm thinking about. And she says, I'm calling it religious trauma. And I'm going to tell you, Jeremy, the minute those words came out of her mouth, my whole brain just kind of flipped upside down and new wires started firing off. And I thought to myself, damn, that's what I've been seeing clinically for
Hmm.
decades. Decades. I've been seeing people who are dealing with trauma that was directly related to their religious upbringing or current relationships, marriage, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's like once you name something, sometimes it opens a whole new world. And that's what happened to me. And that's when and it was happening about the same time as I started thinking I need to help people find therapists.
Hmm.
And as a result, and I've been doing online dating. I thought, well, how does a therapist in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who's an atheist, how do they advertise? Because they can't say I'm secular. I mean, the word secular is like Satan
Yeah.
to somebody, and no judge, no minister. You're not going to get referrals. You're going to lose your whole practice. So the therapists are under real danger for revealing who they are. That they're not a Christian counselor, for example. And so, and then there's clients that need to feel safe and secure in contacting a therapist. So I said, I have to vet them. I have to start vetting and putting together a database. And I think it was 24, 25 therapists that I personally knew. And I
Hmm.
talked them into joining so May 1st of 2012, I put those 25, 24 in there and started advertising saying, hey, if you're interested in joining this database, please do. And for the first 3 years or so, I did all the vetting just personally until I
Yeah.
got a pretty good database I think we had about 150. And then I turned it over to Dr. Caleb Black, excuse me, and he ran it for about 5 years and got it up to about 600. And then today is Dr. Travis McKee Vorst is our director. He's been the director for about 4 years. And we just passed 800. We're at 805 therapists now in
Sure.
nine different countries and 45 U.S. states. So it's been a long, long. I am. I don't give up easily. I'm very
Sure.
tenacious, and when I know there's an idea that's worthwhile and worthy, I will stick with it. And I'm usually pretty good at finding people like Dr. Lack or Dr. Travis to to follow up and keep things running and kind of keep work with them. So anyway, we passed 33,650 clients registered on their website of Secular
Hmm.
Therapy Project. All this data is just as of this week. So it's been remarkable, and the growth curve. If I showed you the growth curve, is just slowly but surely turning up, which
Yeah.
we're increasing speed because we're getting more people aware of what we're doing, both on the client side, and we pay for not a lot of money. We pay a little bit of money to get advertising out on Facebook and
Hmm.
Instagram places. So we're raising awareness. We're getting more donors. And many of our therapists are. We ask our therapists, if you're a member of Secular Therapy Project and you're getting clients from us, please donate. I mean, because you're
Right.
supporting. And so we're getting more therapists, putting some bucks into it, and
Hmm.
that, of course, grows it. It becomes self-sustaining, I guess you could say. It was coming literally out of my pocket for the first 3 or 4 years. I was paying for everything,
Yeah.
but I haven't had to do that in about 7 or 8 years. So I'm pretty happy that it's taken off on its own. Does that
Well,
answer a
and
little bit of your question?
yeah, and I think a lot of my this podcast is geared towards therapists. So
Yeah.
as somebody who's on the directory, like the vetting process is actually pretty not intense. It's not time consuming, but like it's not just check a box and say that you're secular. Like it's an actual for client safety checking and making sure that people are practicing in a way that's aligned with a secular worldview.
Yep, absolutely. And I don't know of anybody else of any other persuasion that's doing something like this. I don't know who vets therapists. I've
Right.
never heard of that before. So, oh, I should say that I didn't tell the part about the online dating. When you're on online dating, you have anonymity between the two parties.
Hmm.
And so when we designed the Secular Therapy Project software, we designed it based upon like a Match.com or an
Sure.
eHarmony or Fish, Plenty of Fish. So you could interact with the therapist, and that both would be anonymous until they decided to do business together, and then they could go outside of our system.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of people ask questions over the years. Well, what has anybody ever been outed? Are you afraid the clients will come in and out the therapist? And we've literally never had that happen. Never. So
Yeah.
I mean, it could happen, but we do a lot to try and protect both parties. I mean, we got clients, they don't want their family knowing that they're seeing a secular therapist because they told them, yeah, well, go see a counselor that's Christian, or they don't
Right.
want anybody to know it. So we have to protect both sides. You know how it works, but your
Yeah.
viewers, that's why I'm saying all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think you brought it up earlier, like that stigma still exists. Maybe not, I think the word secular is a little softer, but like still saying something like atheist, like for a lot of people,
Oh
that's a
yeah.
big turnoff.
Yep. And the importance of what we do isn't just for Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Birmingham, Alabama. It also is for San Francisco,
Hmm.
because you go to, they may not be fundamentalists in California, but there's a whole lot of woo-woo bullshit. I mean, a whole lot of non-evidence-based therapeutic approaches that
Yeah.
we try our best to keep that out. And the only problem we've ever had was we had, especially early on, it was back in about 2013 or 14, we had some applicants that we did not vet as well as we should have. We were still learning. I mean, it
Hmm.
wasn't like we should have known, but and it turned out they had some real woo-woo new age bullshit kind of stuff about 3 pages into their website. So we learned real quickly you got to dig a little deeper than just the front page of their website.
Yeah.
And we don't take your word for it. You got to provide us some evidence.
Hmm.
Now people could still fool us, but we haven't any problems with that.
Yeah, and like I said, going through it, like the vetting, I emailed back and forth with someone who was checking my profile, and they had some questions. I come from a strong Christian evangelical background, so it doesn't take long to find me at a Christian school
Yeah,
where I was
yeah,
working or
yeah,
whatever. So they're like, hey, like just checking in on this and checking in on this. So like that vetting process is, again, I think with client safety in mind is really wonderful, to make
yeah.
sure that, because there are people who will say, oh, I'm Christian, but it doesn't affect my practice, and then they're praying with clients, or they're doing these things that are unsafe or triggering for clients.
One of our actually two, but one of our vetting team members, she's not on the team anymore. She resigned a couple of years ago, but she was actually from Liberty University. She had gotten a PhD, and I saw that on her application. There were big red flags here. We
Yeah.
don't want a Liberty, but it turned out she's an atheist now. So she had
Mhm.
gone through that whole. So in some ways, she has a much better understanding, of what religious trauma might look like. But that was kind of funny. And since then, I'll bet we've had a half a dozen different therapists come to us, as marriage and family, or other kinds of specialties, and they graduate from Liberty or Regents University or Oral Roberts.
Yeah.
But if they could convince us, that they're no longer in that persuasion, that's a big thing. I will
Yeah.
tell you a funny story. Early on, well, not early on, but about 5 years ago, I had a PhD psychologist try to register, and he was a graduate, got his PhD at Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame. So obviously a very good school and probably
Mhm.
a very good PhD program. And I said, but he was Catholic, and he put it right in his application. He's Catholic. I said, well, okay, I'm not closed minded enough to throw you out, but let me ask you a question. And my only question was, you got a 21-year-old woman that you've been seeing for 3 or 4 weeks. After that was third or fourth session, she comes in, says she just found out she's pregnant and she's going to go get an abortion tomorrow, and she wants some help dealing with the anxiety and stress of walking through all those Christians that are going to harass her into the clinic.
Mhm.
How would you help her? And I waited 2 weeks, and then I emailed him again. What's your answer to this question? Because I'm waiting
Yeah.
to see if I can approve you or not. And he finally, about 3 weeks, after 3 weeks, he mailed and said, I couldn't help her. Okay, this is a fucking PhD, and he can't keep his religion out of his practice.
Yeah.
That moment, I said, okay, we have to be even more diligent. We don't make it a requirement that you be an atheist, but you damn well better be close to it, because I don't want anybody refusing service to a client because they're gay, or because
Right.
they're pregnant, because they want an abortion. There's a whole lot of shit that comes down when
Mhm.
somebody when the therapist can't keep their own values out of the therapy session.
Yeah, and while we're working with something like religious trauma, like that is unsafe for a client. And so we're re-traumatizing or we're creating new trauma for those
Yeah.
clients who are seeking help and are vulnerable. And then someone's gonna start a session off with a prayer or something like that.
Yep. Yep. Well, it could be even more subtle than that. I've got a pet peeve. This is a great place to talk about it, actually, because my pet peeve my pet peeve is that there's a lot of people that say they're spiritual but not religious. Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. I can deal with that when it comes to clients. I can't deal with it when it comes to a therapist. If they can't keep that spiritual bullshit, that supernatural notions out of their practice. So the bottom line for a therapist to get into psychotherapy project is you have to prove to us you do not hold supernatural beliefs.
Hmm.
It's that simple. And being new age, being spiritual but not religious, means you still think there's shit going on that you can't see, hear, or feel, or validate that's supernatural. It's outside of the realm of human senses. That
Hmm.
that is not appropriate. It shouldn't be appropriate in any therapy session. And I'm one of my pet peeve is that there's a lot of people in the therapy field who really buy into this spiritual shit.
Hmm.
How do you and that is a re-traumatizing thing, or it's taken people down another primrose path to trauma, and it doesn't help people deal with reality. If you're saying, well, you need to let the spirit of God lead you, or you need the spirit of Zeus lead you, I don't care. It's still gobbledygook, and it's not going to help somebody deal with their depression
Hmm.
or their anxiety about losing their whole family if they leave the church, that sort of stuff. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up the new age stuff. I mean, whether it's wellness or crystals or here's the supplement that you need to take, like again, for people who are missing that meaning making that religion provided for them, it's easy to get sucked in or pulled into some other cult adjacent behavior.
Yeah. Yep. And the worst thing is when the therapist is sucked into that cult,
Yeah.
because there's a hell of a lot of therapists out there that'll tell you what supplements to take.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
just saying, don't go to your
Yeah.
therapist to find out your supplements.
There's a lot of overlap, I think, between some of that magical thinking in, religion or evangelicalism, which is what I was raised in, and some
Yeah.
of the wellness industry and the self-help industry.
Yep. My mentor, just to throw another detail in, my mentor in graduate school and later I off and on studied under him for quite a while, was Albert Ellis.
Hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with Albert
Yeah.
Ellis.
Rational emotive behavior therapy.
Yeah, the godfather of what we now know as cognitive behavioral therapy. So I learned rather early on from him how to be pretty tough in your in the way you analyze behavior and analyze your thought processes.
Hmm.
And and when I see people being squishy and loosey goosey about their terminology and their language, I see someone who's going to confuse a client. Now, if the client wants to be loosey goosey and squishy and all that, that's the client's issue. But the therapist should have better language skills and better rational skills to understand what they're seeing, hearing, and feeling, and not let their own supernatural bullshit get into it.
Hmm.
I know I come off as a hard ass, probably harder than I really am, but I just don't want people to be hurt. And if
Hmm.
you're a therapist, you should not be practicing shit that can hurt people. And of course, I don't think any therapist thinks they're hurting anybody. Every therapist who practices new age bullshit thinks they're helping them. I understand that's what they think.
Hmm.
The evidence just is not there, though. Anyway,
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't
and
know
I
where you
think
want to go with that, but that's where I went.
no, I think that segues into talking about how some of these things are like spiritual bypassing. It's avoiding doing the work,
Yep.
and there's soothing. I'll put that in quotation marks. There's some version of soothing that happens, but it's not doing the work that needs to happen. So it's sidestepping some of the discomfort, whether it's say 10 Hail Marys or it's squeeze your favorite crystal. Like, right, it's not addressing what the root cause of that symptom is.
Right, right. And a skilled therapist, and I've watched some really skilled therapists in my career, can take you or help you go where you want to go without, they don't need they don't need crystals. They don't need supernatural ideas because they have developed the skills that a good therapist should have in, in probably understanding or helping the other person understand what's going on in their own mind. Anyway, so we're within our framework, and we've only talked about Secular Therapy Project, I know, but that's Secular Therapy Project, just to make sure we've covered all the bases, is a sub program of Recovery from Religion. And we have dozens of programs. Secular Therapy is just one of the gigantic ones, and it's kind of self-funding and self-supporting, but still it reports to the board of directors.
And Recovering from Religion is my favorite resources tab for people who are deconstructing, because it has so much information. It's the best place to start, in my opinion, for if you're questioning or how do you deal with this topic. The resources page is fantastic, but then podcasts and videos and talks and all those things. So just a ton of great free accessible resources for people.
Right. And we don't charge a thing for any of our services. Everything we do is for free. Our donors supply the money for what we're doing.
Yeah. Let's talk about you being a hard ass. I think some of it, being familiar with some of Albert Ellis's work, I like to use kind of his, he wouldn't have termed it sarcastic, but almost catastrophizing for a client, taking their concerns to a ridiculous point where they realize how silly it is. I use that a lot in my work. But the trope of kind of the angry atheist, you talk about not wanting people to be hurt. And I think religion, especially in America, has such a privileged status that people assume, oh, well, this person is a man of God, so how could he be a bad person? Even though we know, well, there's all this data that says the most likely perpetrators of sexual abuse are pastors or priests. So I don't think it's so much as, at least professionally speaking, it's being an angry atheist. I think it's speaking out where there's injustice, where there's still a system of oppression that's allowed to exist and almost hold a privileged status.
Exactly. And that's what I don't want to see among therapists, because therapists are scared to challenge religion in the clinical setting. And I am okay with being careful. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being careful, and we're not trying to impose our values on them. But I'm also don't want to let people get away with shit, so they continue to sabotage themselves or undermine their own. So if you play along and don't challenge them, you're part of the problem, and you're taking people's money and giving them, and hurting them potentially. So, I'm all about do no harm, and they're just I'll tell you this. One of the things I'm seeing a lot of right now, and part of the reason Secular Therapy Project is so important, is there's so many religious schools in the last 30 years have opened up their own marriage and family programs or counseling programs or psychology programs. And for example, at the Regents University, where Pat Robertson's university, it requires a PhD level candidate to take 1 year of Pat Robertson theology. Theology that says God sends hurricanes to Orlando because of the gays. Now, if you have to take a year of that kind of theology to get your PhD, you're still licensable in probably all 50 states. What are you going to do with that? That is really, really bad training. It's poor training. And there's hundreds of colleges, universities that now have religiously based marriage and family counseling and clinical psychology and counseling psychology programs. And they're training people, how do you weave Jesus into your therapy? And don't call yourself a Christian counselor, but you can still be a counselor that follows Christ. I mean, I've heard that. And because they're getting wise to this Christian counseling notion that is, and there's a lot of clients that say, I need a counselor that's Christian. I don't want a secular counselor. Well, okay. But that means you're not getting a well-trained counselor. And you end up getting re-traumatized.
And the Speaker of the House, his wife was a pastoral counselor.
I know.
Not licensed, not anything. I mean, her style of therapy was batshit crazy. I wrote my longest blog post I've ever written was just like a point by point takedown of like why this is terrible. But
Yeah.
it's almost as the people leave church, the rise of the nuns, as people like to call it, the non-religious, but the extremists, the evangelicals who are still in it, are getting more and more extreme. Like the Speaker of the House being in a covenant marriage, like that's so wild.
Yep. Yep. And he never looks at porn. And if he does, his son knows about it
He
because they're
sends
both
it to
using
his kid.
covenant eyes.
Well, and I think it's one of those things too with like journalism and counteracting the angry atheist trope. I think as an activist is trying to take care of people and protect people from being harmed, we have to speak out about this stuff. Like a lot of people don't know how covenant eyes works. Where like
Yeah.
I've worked with people who were in accountability groups back when I was a Christian, and I was progressive and liberal, but like still identified as a Christian. And like these accountability groups all fail together. One person
Yeah.
looks at porn, they all get notified, and then they all do because it's like, oh, somebody slipped up, so here's our free pass. Like clockwork, that's how it works. And so like I think the media grabs something like Covenant Eyes, like this is weird, let's write about it, but doesn't know enough about how it actually works to be like, oh, hey, this is problematic. That's like sending your 17-year-old what porn you're watching. Like that's weird. Why are you in government? You probably shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, there's other iterations of that thing, like that kind of thing, like sex addiction groups. I've had many people or gay pray the gay away groups.
Yeah, conversion camps.
Or just conversion groups that meet regularly. What I've had way too many people tell me that's where I got my dates.
Right. Yeah.
You go to a place where people are trying to recover and then offer them more of what they're quote addicted. Well, hell yeah. You go to Alcoholics Anonymous group and pass the beer around.
Yeah. Be hosting AA at a bar instead of a church.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, it's crazy. But there's a lot, and I think you're right. The anger atheist piece gets mislabeled. I actually think there is such a thing as angry atheists. I think there's people that have not dealt with their own anger around being deceived and lied to by whatever religion they came out of, whether it be Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. I don't care. They all are lying to you at some level and significantly lying to you. So to feel that anger, sense of betrayal, is perfectly understandable. I just want to help, but on the other side of that coin, you need to get over that anger sooner or later because you're wasting a lot of your valuable life and energy on something that's not going to go anywhere. And you're not going to convert or deconvert anybody with that kind of anger and behavior. In fact, it actually usually drives people back into religion. I don't want to be around Darrel because he's an angry atheist. So I'm not here as an angry atheist. I'm here as a person who's angry about what religion does to people and how therapists shouldn't be hurting people more because of they aren't taking their own journey seriously and their own skill set development seriously.
Yeah. Darrel, far be it from me to call someone old, but you have been in the field longer than I have. Marlene Wibnell's Leaving the Fold came out in 1994. That's almost 30 years ago. What are some of the changes that you've seen in the field, even the concept of like religious trauma being introduced, but the rise of like sex education and online, some of these things are more accessible to people. How have you kind of seen that shift within the field of people working with religious trauma?
Well, I have, and you can call me old. I'm 39 and holding. That's where I come.
Hey, you're 4 years older than me.
I have seen. I'm privileged in the sense I've seen the development of therapy and psychology and the clinical work over. I got into clinical. My first exposure was after I left seminary. I got a job as a counselor in a juvenile facility. And as a result of being in that facility for a few months, I realized, well, I kind of like this counseling stuff. So that's when I went back to Peabody Vanderbilt and started working on my doctorate in counseling psych. But so I that was real early. That was 1974 that I started there. So I've seen everything up until today. And
Mhm.
what I can say is in the 1970s and through the 80s, this religious bullshit was not in the clinical setting. I didn't hear, I never heard the term Christian counselor. That was, no, I never heard that term. I never knew a therapist that thought it was appropriate to pray with a client. I, I mean, it just was mind boggling now to see this happening. So,
Mhm.
yes, there's been a huge shift, but it's away from science based clinical practices, or at least peer reviewed, potentially scientifically validated. I'm not saying every theory that comes out of current psychology is gobbledygook, because at one point in time cognitive therapy was gobbledygook too, and
Mhm.
it just takes time for new theories to be proven or disproven. It's just the way science works.
Right.
So these folks are, I mean, the folks that are I'm seeing come out are now being educated in schools that didn't exist when I was around.
Mhm.
I was going to Vanderbilt. I was getting a doctorate from one of the best schools, period. I mean, I really valued what I got there. But right across, well, not across, a couple miles away is Belmont College, which is a conservative Baptist university. And they've now got a PhD that did not exist when I was around.
Sure.
And there's all sorts of Christian bullshit. You cannot be a gay professor at Belmont. Now, I will just say there are gay professors there. They just
Right.
keep real quiet.
Yeah.
But there was a gay coach, a lesbian coach of a national champion team. They fired her because she came out as lesbian.
Mhm.
So, what kind of training are you giving people? And what kind of now? And you're getting that from those kind of universities, and that didn't exist when I was around. Now, places like Regents University is a fairly new university too. They didn't have a PhD program, but they do now.
Yeah.
And there was a woman on a local radio show here that uh, PhD from Pat Robertson's University, and she was on the show in Kansas City, touting her new book on the horrors of sex addiction and how you keep your children out of internet porn and all this sort of bullshit. And they were treating her like she had some amazing valid scientific research behind it, and
Mhm.
there is zilch and zero. I called into the I called into the show. I heard, I saw it. I called into the show. I was listening as I was driving around, and I called in. And I asked him. I told him what I wanted to talk about. I stayed on that show for that show lasted an hour. I was on that show for 45 minutes, and they never answered. They never let me ask my question. In the
Yeah.
meantime, there was a dozen other people that got their questions in there, but I never got mine in. So I wrote
Mhm.
a really nice long letter to the general manager of the radio program saying, "Why are you touting this pseudoscience bullshit and all that?" I would like to be on there to refute what she said. They never responded to my letter, but
Yeah. Yeah.
pisses
Well,
me off.
that's
If that's an angry atheist, then I'm an angry atheist.
well, so interesting. That's why I brought up the historical perspective, because thinking like pre-Reagan, how things maybe looked. Whereas like I grew up in the '90s, and so I've seen a negative response to some of the religion. Most people who are in my age range are, we know people who are deconstructing or have already deconstructed. Like the elder millennials have left church in droves. So like, it's fascinating to kind of look at that. Right, if you think '60s and '70s, it was science, and then the religious right started kind of implementing this long-term plan to shift some of these things and normalize
Yep.
religion, homeschools, and some of these things as being with no supervision is the word I want to use, but with no accountability built into it.
Yeah. Right. Right. So I'm sure some of your viewers are from one or more of those schools, and just because you're from one of those schools doesn't mean you're a bad therapist. I don't want to
Right.
leave that taste in your mouth. It means you probably got a lot of extra work to do because you were taught some crazy shit while you were at Regents University or Oral
Yeah.
Roberts or Fox. Or here's the worst one. One of the worst in the nation is Brigham Young. Brigham Young University makes people at any level, any student, before you go into Brigham, you have to sign a waiver that says, I will not masturbate. I will not look at porn. I will not have sex
Yeah.
outside of marriage. All the things that I had done by the time I was 18
Right.
and more. And these people are going in there with that kind of an attitude and education, and then they're leaving to go out and do things. For example, there's these gay, conversion ranches out in Utah that are being run by master's level graduates of Brigham Young University, and
Mhm.
they're charging insurance companies for children that are being sent from Massachusetts, from Alabama to these camps, and they're claiming that the children are, being treated for depression to the insurance company. But then they're telling the parent, but we will treat their sex addiction. So
Right.
you got a 12, 13-year-old kid whose mom caught him masturbating or caught him with a Playboy magazine, and now they're sending him off to get, sex addiction treatment. What? Why? How would you? That's just mind-boggling. A 13-year-old cannot be a sex addict.
Right.
And nobody is, by the way, but certainly not a 13-year-old. And so we've got insurance companies that were buying into that. Now, in the last few years, they've gotten wise to this, and they're starting to ask more questions.
Mhm.
So the insurance aren't paying for this so-called depression that's really diagnosed as sex addiction, and there's no such diagnosis, of course,
Mhm.
but it's still there. And those camps haven't gone bankrupt. The parents are just having to pay more out of their own pocket. Well,
Right.
still wrong. And how does it damage these boys? And it's largely boys. There are girls that go there, but it's almost all boys. And they're being supervised by men who think you can't masturbate. Of course, they did not masturbate themselves that morning before they went to tell the boys they can't masturbate.
Right.
It's just horrible. Now,
Mhm.
so that's pet peeve number 2 here, and that is the American Counseling Association, American Psychological Association, but especially the American Counseling Association, is overlooking these egregious things that are going on. These people
Mhm.
are, Brigham Young University, at least last I checked, their programs were still accredited by the American Counseling Association.
Yeah.
Nobody is saying, look, where's the American Counseling Association when a therapist brings the Bible out in their clinical setting?
Mhm.
Where's that counseling association when those kids are being virtually tortured at a camp by accredited counselors from Brigham Young University? That
Mhm.
is pissing me off more than almost anything else, because those kids are huge victims of a system that's religiously motivated.
Yeah. Well,
They
and
have to be
then the
attacked.
onus is on those kids or clients who have a therapist who's practicing unethically to file a report, and like that may or may not happen. I in this day and age, I very rarely see clients, or I very rarely see therapists lose their license. They get put on probation, but like there aren't enough therapists, so these accreditation boards aren't pulling licenses. So the abuse happens, and they either lose their accreditation and stay open and charge out of pocket, or like the abuse
Mm-hmm.
keeps going on, and we get news stories of horrific abuse at Christian Day program training. Like, how many of those need to happen before,
Yeah.
we as a society say like, right, this is harming people.
And the boards themselves, and of course, every state has its own board of some kind, whether it's the licensing board or the health board or whatever. And far too many of those people are deeply religious themselves,
Right.
and they're very hesitant to clamp down on abuse of religious privilege within some clinical setting.
Yeah.
So there are just no checks and balances here to stop Christianity. And it's just gotten worse. I know you didn't see the 60s and 70s. I did. But through the 90s and early 2000s, I saw this growth, incredible growth of purity culture, of course,
Hmm.
which feeds right into it, because how many counselors believe that, you know, some forms of sexual expression are ungodly,
Right.
and they're there to help discourage kids who think they're gay or might be trans or something like that.
Yeah. And
Damn,
even
we've gone down a hell of a rabbit hole here.
well, I think even with purity culture, I'll pick your brain a little bit on. I think a lot of people are aware how purity culture harms women because it's so steeped in patriarchy. But as a male therapist, I see a lot of guys who are coming out of purity culture, and it's been maybe not just as it's not a competition, but it has also been harmful for the
Yeah,
guys who are
right.
raised in it.
Yeah, that reminds me. I wrote an article about 5 or 6 years ago called "Male Shame" and the other side of the coin to female shame. And I explore that very thing, that purity culture hurt women a lot, but let's look at how it's perpetuated and how men were hurt by it as well. You might be interested in that article. Just male shame. If you Google male shame and Darrel Ray, it'll probably come up. It's in our resources too. If you do male shame within our resources, but the thesis is men were hurt by purity culture in invisible ways, in ways that aren't as obvious. I mean, with purity culture in the 90s, you could see girls being forced to go to a ball with their father and wear a purity ring and dance with their father in what appeared to be a wedding dress, and sign pledges and all that bullshit. Mm-hmm. But boys were being taught some crazy stuff too, about what's the role of women. The women are supposed to be ultimately subservient to men. Mm-hmm. And looking at porn will ruin your marriage. I mean, there's a whole set of beliefs and ideas that boys were getting. The girls didn't get as much, or it's a whole different set of guidelines and ideas. And mm-hmm. both sides are just useless, but they're harmful. They're more than worse than these. They're harmful. And I think that article, I think there's a lot to be said, Jeremy, for the male side of all this, because I don't think that's been paid attention to. Mm-hmm. Because it's so obvious how bad the problems are on the women's side, but it's just as it's invisible, I guess you could say. And so the reason I think this is important is I see so many men coming to us at Recover from Religion. Well, let me give you an example. About a year and a half ago, we started a women-only group, and it's a virtual group. And within weeks after starting this group, it's an online group facilitated by one of our trained volunteers, not by a therapist. It's not group therapy. It's peer support. And we were getting 25, 30 women showing up to every meeting. And we were having to get extra facilitators in to be able to break the group up. Women were joining us from 3 or 4 countries, from Japan, from Australia, from California, all in the same meeting. And we could see a real need for women to talk about this stuff away from the ears of men, which I fully understand, I fully support. I mean, so we've had this meeting going for a year and a half. About 3 months ago, one of our volunteers said, "Why don't we have a men's meeting? What's going on here? Why don't we have a men's?" And we debated and discussed it for a while. Said, "Well, let's give it a try. See if there's any market, I guess you could say, out there for it." Mm-hmm. And we announced it, got it going. I think there were 3 or 4 guys showed up the first meeting. Second meeting, we had 17 guys show up. Yeah. Now our next meeting was like 2 days ago. I haven't heard how many showed up, but boy, there is a market there, and I'm not talking in capitalistic terms. There's a need there. It's more probably a better term for it. And what these guys are talking about, this purity stuff really, really affected their ability to communicate with women, to understand what the dating world is, to accept rejection, or how to approach a woman without seeming like a creepy predator. And women were taught that men are fundamentally predators. So women are coming at men from an angle that is puzzling to the men. I haven't even kissed a woman yet. How can I be a predator? Right. And this, I think there's a whole area to be explored now on the male side. I think we've opened up a can of worms on the female side, and that can of worms is we're starting to understand it better. But I think there's a lot more. And that's why I wrote that article on male shame, because men have a lot of shame. Mm-hmm. And the religion itself teaches this. The most obvious example is honor killings in whether Pakistan, or there was an honor killing in Toronto, or Saudi Arabia. Well, an honor killing is just an expression of male shame. If you're female, if you are supposed to kill, you are supposed to control your females, whether that's your sister, your wife, your daughter. You're supposed to control them if you're a man. If they don't abide by your patriarchal rules, then that gives you the right then you have to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And if it reflects directly on you as a man, as a male. So now I feel shame. My daughter has shamed me by kissing a boy without being married to him. So now I have to go kill her because the actual murder act of murder is a direct result of my shame about not being able to control my women. Well, that sounds, we all could agree that's heinous and incredibly uncivilized and psychologically, obviously damaging to everybody. But where did the guy learn the shame? He learned it from Islam. Purity culture does the same thing. We just don't go so far with it. How many families have kicked their own child out of the house because their daughter was having sex, outside of marriage, or that they have a gay child, and they disown their own children because of male shame. You have brought shame upon our family. As a Mormon in Utah, the girl goes out, has sex after the prom, dad finds out. You have brought shame upon our family. And so there's male shame is now going to be expressed in the form of some kind of punishment for the females. That's how male shame works. And there's a lot more to it, of course, but I've never heard anybody talking about it from this angle. Maybe I'm wrong. Have you heard anybody talking about it?
No, I tried to run a group. I tried to run a purity culture group for men with a therapist I know, and we had, I think, 2 guys sign up for it. But every therapist we talk to who works in religious harm or sex educators that I work with, like, this is needed, this is needed, this is needed. But I think you're talking about the shame piece of it is so limiting for guys to admit that they have sexual problems or that they were harmed by purity culture. I think, because there's this guilt around, like, but I'm privileged, like, as a male, there's that awareness of your privilege, but also, like, how can it be true that there's privilege there and it's still harming you?
Yeah, I think this notion of privilege needs to, it's too much like a sledgehammer. There's just not enough nuance there.
Yeah.
If you are the top 10%, top 1%, you're clearly privileged. I mean, the richest person in a group or the best looking person in a group, privileged. But the rest of the population falls below that. And they can be as much victims of this system as anybody else. I mean, men are victimized by purity culture as much as women are victimized by purity culture. You can't separate. They're part of a system. And you can't separate them. And when you try to separate them, you do injustice to both sides, I think.
Yeah.
So I think, and the fact that, for example, when I was going to school and up through the 80s, and then that changed, sex education was always terrible, but at least it was better than what it is now. And we actually had sex education, and they actually told us about condoms in the school I went to. And 10 years later, that would have gotten a teacher or whoever's teaching it fired for telling a kid about condom. And it was in 1995 that Dr. Jocelyn Elders got fired as a Surgeon General because she talked about masturbation as a normal thing. Are you old enough to remember that under the Clinton administration?
I would have been 7, so probably not. But, like, growing up, hearing about, like, all the innuendos around getting a blowjob in the White House. Like, I grew up in purity culture, so even, like, my parents would turn the news off. Like, that was so taboo to even know those things existed. And again, I as a therapist now, I see guys struggling with, like, lack of education. Like, it's funny in society to make fun of guys who don't know where the clit is, but, like, for people who are raised in purity culture, like, they're not taught anatomy. They're not taught that pleasure is a part of intercourse. And so, like, it is one of those things where, you can be in a privileged status and be victimized. Like, those things are not mutually exclusive. They can be both true at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and then there's the whole issue of whether you're religious or not, whether you're raised religious or not, you still live in a religious culture that has crazy religious ideas. I call this the Oprah effect. I mean, Oprah Winfrey gets on on her show and starts talking about sex addiction or starts talking about porn addiction, and suddenly it's a thing. In 1983, Dr. Patrick Carnes wrote the first book on sex addiction, and he's made a cottage industry out of that ever since. I think he's published 5 books on sex addiction. How can you publish 5 books on something that you can't even agree has got a diagnostic criteria? But he's done it, and he's a darling of the religious right. Dr. James Dobson, all those people love Carnes, even though he says what he says is not, quote, religiously based. He will say that. I've seen him say it. But if you look at the damn test he gives people to identify if you're a sex addict, it's almost I do a talk on the myth of sex addiction, and I give there were 500 people in this at the Free Thought Conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma about 5 years ago. I handed a copy of his test out to everybody. I said, please take this test. And everybody did it. And then as I got started on my talk, I said, stand up if you're a sex addict, according to this test. And about 80% of the people stood up. It was crazy. So if a test can't discriminate between or discern, between people who have real problems and people who have fantasy problems, Carnes is just a fantasist. He's created a whole cottage industry. And whether he was religious or not, religion has jumped onto that. And Oprah Winfrey has jumped onto that. Churches love it because now they can have, like they have an AA meeting every week in the basement of their church, they can have a sex addiction anonymous meeting in their church too, run by probably a well-trained sexual predator. Who knows? It's,
Yeah. Well, and every man's battle, like, we talk about Covenant Eyes, every man's battle, like these books, these programs, these things that are capitalistic in nature are making money off of these religious groups and based on no science. Evangelical, which is what I was raised in, so I can criticize it freely. The belief is in your heart. And so like there is no need for science or logic, which is how they've been kind of co-opted by Trumpism and all of that stuff, where there is no critical thinking, because critical thinking is anathema to believe it in your heart.
Yep, absolutely. I'm sorry.
Go ahead if you had a segue.
Oh, I didn't really have a segue. I didn't plan on talking about this today, but I'm glad we did, because I think it's important for therapists to start. I think many therapists, how do I couch this diplomatically? I think therapists have to continually work on how they're being influenced by the culture around them, and be aware that the media influences therapists just like it influences everybody else. I have heard too many therapists buy into this religious notion of sex addiction or porn addiction. And when they buy into it, that's the culture influencing them. They're not doing it because of the science, because there is no science there. In addition, they are misdiagnosing the person who is simply using sex or porn to deal with other lower lying issues, whether that's, there's any number of things they could be dealing with, least of which is probably depression, not the least of which is probably depression. But a therapist who doesn't, it's lazy, it's being a lazy therapist is what it is, to accept some of the stuff that's coming into us from the culture. And our clients are bringing it in too. The client will come in and says, I think I'm a sex addict.
Right.
Well, you need to help the client understand the research shows the most highest likely of you being a sex addict is if you're from a religion that says you're a sex addict. It's not the science that's doing that for you. So I don't know. I could go on my high horse. I'm not sitting in the clinical. I'm not sitting in the office listening to the psychiatrists or psychologists or whoever. I'm just seeing the results. I'm having people come to us and saying my last 2 therapists agreed that I was a sex addict. Okay. Right. Well, wait a minute. What kind of therapy is that? And why are they? And they came to the Secular Therapy Project, and I said, look, anybody in the Secular Therapy Project, I won't guarantee it, but I'll put a 99% down that they will not agree that you're a sex addict, and they won't treat you as a sex addict. And if I find out they did, we're going to get rid of them real quick.
Well, and the research, I mean, this was a recent study that just reaffirmed that pornography usage only causes problem for people who are from a religious background who think that it causes problems. Like
Yeah,
it has nothing to do with the usage itself. It has to do with your belief system attached to it. Um,
exactly. Yep.
and I know studying porn in academia is difficult to get good scientific research because there's no control group because more than 95% of people watch porn. So it's so difficult. So you have this vacuum that these Christian publishing houses come in with their pseudoscience and publish stories, and there's
Yeah.
no, I don't want to say there's no counterbalance, but like I know it's difficult to study because you don't have a control group because of how ubiquitous porn use is.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the fact that porn use is highest among the most religious zip codes in the United States, that's another issue that's kind of funny.
Yeah.
And Utah and Mississippi are number 1 and number 2 in porn use.
Right. And you see those occasionally those maps. I don't know how scientifically validated they are, but like the most searched terms on Pornhub for each state and those types of things.
Well, they are valid. And there's been other things. There was a book published about 10 years ago, maybe even more, called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And I think it was 2 social psychologists out of Stanford, I think. They were just looking at IP addresses and where the porn searches were coming from. And they validated. And then Pornhub started doing that later. Pornhub simply validating what these academicians already found.
Yeah.
It is funny.
Yeah.
By the way, it's old but not dated. I'll just say this. I did some research about 10 years ago called Sex and Secularism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's available. It's free. It's a PDF. You can get it online. I can even send it to you if you want. But we looked at 14,590 respondents that we found on the internet. We just put this survey up and asked people to take the survey. And only people we were interested in were people who are not religious. We only wanted non-religious people. So we excluded anybody who currently identifies themselves as religious. And some identified as agnostic, some as atheist, some as, spiritual but not religious. I don't know. But if they were religious, they were eliminated. And out of that, we found some fascinating results from this. And one of the things we found was men and women watch just about the same amount of porn. And men and women start sex within 3 to 6 months of 16, 17 years of age, regardless of whether they were in purity culture training or not.
Yeah.
That what we found was the same thing the U.S. government found in its research, that you can take a abstinence only or purity culture course, and it will delay the onset of intercourse by about 3 to 6 months. But you still start having intercourse. You start having sex.
Yeah.
And that looking at porn, same thing. Purity culture kids start looking at porn about 3 months later than non-purity culture. It doesn't stop them. It just slows them down a little bit.
Yeah, and makes it less safe. We know unplanned pregnancies and
the unplanned pregnancy
bit.
Not teaching about birth control, saying abortion is, all bad and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, go look that up, or let me send you a link to it, because the research, like I said, it's old, but it's not dated. Everything we found, we did a follow-up survey about 5 years later, and our results were almost identical. It was a totally different set of people.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that what we found was solid. And the reason I'm recommending it is because it's secular focused, and your clients, your therapists are getting secular clients, and our data will help you understand what secular people are thinking and how they're, because about 60% of all the people in our survey had been religious or were raised religious like you were, but are now secular.
Right.
And the other 40% were raised secular. So what we did is we took those two groups and we compared them. And that's really interesting comparison group, because the religious group were still religious at 13, 14, 15 years of age. The secular group were secular at 13, 14, 15. So we simply asked, when did you start looking at porn for both groups? When did you start having sex for the first time? When did you masturbate for the first time? And we could see that there was almost no difference between these two groups.
Yeah.
It was a great way to compare them.
Almost as if it's a natural process and has
Oh,
nothing to do with.
almost as if there are hormones flowing or something.
Hey, how are we doing for time, Darrel? Do you have a couple more minutes?
Yeah, a couple more minutes, and I probably need to get going.
Okay.
I'm not in a huge hurry, but yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things I just wanted to touch base on, because you're openly polyamorous, and it's one of those things that I see a lot in the deconstruction community. I think it's joked about, but there's some reality to people who kind of deconstruct their religion often will then deconstruct the concept of monogamy. And I'm just curious if again, it's one of those things you've kind of seen culturally shift, if there have been ebbs and flows for the stigma attached to that, and kind of where you feel like the field's at right now.
Oh gosh, we could do a whole program on that.
I know. Sorry, I saved it for the end.
Well, I got divorced in 1980, early 88. We separated in 87. I'd been married for 17 years. And within a few months, I had a very close friend. We're still really close friends. Dr. Dan Dana moved in with me because he had just gone through a divorce too. And Dan is a avid reader, as am I. And he said, hey, you might want to look at this book called Loving More by Dr. Deborah Anapol. I read it, and it was the first book ever published. I believe it was the first book ever published on polyamory.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I was exposed to the notion of polyamory in the late 80s. And through the 90s, I didn't, I realized I probably should be poly, but the culture wasn't there yet. And neither were the dating sites. You couldn't put polyamorous on the Plenty of Fish dating site.
Sure.
Well, it didn't exist actually. So I went ahead and went through the monogamy phase again with a second wife, which is a stupid mistake. And then by 2001, that marriage ended. I was only married 3 years, and that marriage ended. I realized, okay, this is dumb. Why am I staying monogamous? It's not me. And so I openly started practicing polyamory. And by that time, some of the websites were more poly-friendly to it, and some articles were coming out. Of course, the Ethical Slut was written about 1996 or 7,
Yeah.
I think. And of course, I read that, and I just think this is really an important concept, because here's the deal: people have been polyamorous since Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think Steve may have been in there too, or Lilith was in there too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So why are we being dishonest? And what is monogamy anyway but a religious concept? So I started deconstructing my own monogamy. Why did I feel compelled? And why did my partners, for example, feel compelled? And how do we work through this? And oftentimes work through it together. Mm-hmm. And so I started just advertising, hey, I'm out in the dating world. I'm happy to, get a partner or two, but I'm not going to be monogamous. If that's not good enough for you, then let's keep going.
Yeah.
And I was surprised at the number of women that were open to that. I mean, genuinely open to that. Now, at that point in time, I was 51 years old. So, and I'm meeting women that are of the same age range, within 10 years of that. I dated both women that were 5, 6, 7 years older than me, and actually, I dated one was 14 years older than me, and another woman that was 10 years younger than me. So the whole spread. It wasn't an age thing. I mean, I know this fantasy some men have, marrying the 25-year-old. That was never one of my fantasies. I don't want anything to do with that age. That when I was 25, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, and I still. So I've seen poly really open up a lot. When you see HuffPost putting regular articles up on polyamory, or you see not a Wall Street Journal, Washington Post article on polyamory, and you see regular columnists now talking about polyamory, and you see women talking about deconstructing their own monogamy. I want to turn you on. A good friend of mine, Glenda Jordan, just did a talk 2 weeks ago, and it'll be on the RFRX. She did it on RFRX 2 weeks ago, and it was her story and philosophy, deconstructing her monogamy, and she's been polyamorous for about 10 years now with her nesting partner, but she's got 2 other partners. Anyway, she I'll just tell you, Jeremy, she gave the most amazing talk. I have never seen a better talk on polyamory in my life. I don't think I could have given a talk near as good as she did.
Sure.
But here's the interesting thing about the polyamory world. It's led by women. It is not a male fantasy. It is a women's movement. And if you look at all the main books written about polyamory are written by women, starting with Deborah Anapol and with The Ethical Slut by Hardy, Janet Hardy, and Dosa Easton. Almost all the books are by women. That alone says something about where the culture is going and who's leading this.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. I think Jessica Fern wrote Polysecure, which is a little bit more current than Ethical Slut, but in that same kind of line.
No, I'm not.
People.
I'm not. Ethical Slut's not up to date. They do have an up to date revised version, I guess. But
yes, correct. But yeah, no, that'd be great to link to that talk when it gets posted. We'll definitely have that in the show notes.
Yeah, this has been years ago. I started seeing this one woman, or we communicated, I think, through Plenty of Fish or something like that. And we met for coffee one day. And as we're meeting for coffee, I'm telling her I'm polyamorous. Here's what that means. She'd never even heard of the term. And she listens she was a very thoughtful person. She listened carefully and had some good questions. And then at the end, she says, I don't think I can do that. And her words were, I don't share. So, okay, that's fine. So we went our separate ways. About a week later, I get a call from her and she wants to see me again. Okay. Well, you know the story. We dated for 7 or 8 years after that. And the second time we met, it was really kind of funny. The second time we met, she said, okay, I have a confession to make. I do have a boyfriend on the side. And she had a boyfriend on the side for her whole adult life, practically, even when she was married. Yeah. She just had never owned up to it. So she was poly, but unethically non-monogamous, if you will. And it was funny. We're still good friends today, although we're not involved anymore. But it was funny, and we had a great laugh about it. But I think there's a lot of people out there like that.
Yeah.
And the fact that women are leading this tells me that women, of course, we have a lot of evidence that women have not been honest about their sexual past. And for good reason, because our culture shames women for being sluts, and promiscuous and all that, even though men are equally. So, right. But I think once a woman owns her sexuality and says, it's my sexuality, and I don't give a fuck what you think. And if you can't deal with it, that's your problem, not mine. Then they're free to be monogamous or polyamorous if they want to be. I don't even like the word monogamous, by the way. I try to get rid of that word. I think exclusive is a better term. Sure. Because monogamy is one sex partner for life.
For life, yeah.
That's what Jesus defined it to be. And I don't quote Jesus very often, but so if you've had more than one sex partner, then you are not monogamous by definition.
Right.
So I prefer exclusive. So if you want to be exclusive for 50 years, go for it. But you're not monogamous because you had a boyfriend before you dated your husband or whatever, or girlfriend.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway. So we went down that rabbit hole. I could go way down that rabbit hole.
That was great. Well, and I knew that talk had been scheduled. I wasn't able to attend, so it'll be awesome when it gets posted. And like I said, we'll link to the show notes. Tons of great resources, Darrel. I'll link to your book, and Recovering from Religion, like I said, is something I share with clients constantly. It's on my tabs because of how often I copy and paste it, send it to people. So we'll have lots of links in the show notes. So thanks so much for taking the time and taking the time to talk today.
Sure. I hope your folks will go look at my books, God Virus and Sex and God. I think they'll have a lot to say about what you do in the clinical office.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll link to all that stuff. So
Okay.
thanks for taking the time today. And to all our lovely listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another new episode.